we go. Coming up, the New York Football Giants exit draft number 2 with Joe Schoen at the helm, and it feels like Big Blue faithful should be absolutely ecstatic about what they accomplished. But were they able to get all the specific players they had in mind? We talk about Deonte Banks, that little man called Schmitz, and also Jalin Hyatt coming out of the 3rd round and hopefully adding to what should be a high-powered offense this season for Big Blue. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz, breaking down again, further, more deeply, more intently, the NFL draft that was for the New York Football Giants. Andy, we talked about Deonte Banks, obviously, after that first-round selection. We're going to get into a little more detail on the 2nd and 3rd round scenarios that played out, and ultimately, if we're fully satisfied with what Joe Schoen did. But how are we feeling on a Monday? Let's call it an afternoon.
You know, I'm doing good. We're back in the swing of things. The draft is done, but the dust hasn't settled yet. I mean, something that's not settled. I hear rumors that you're moving right now, which is like one of my top 3 least favorite things all time to do.
Rising on my list of least favorite things too, because we did a little winter rental, so that only lasts 6 months. So it's still, the trauma is still fresh, Andy, as we try to wrap up a whole bunch of boxes. But the other thing that got wrapped up was the NFL draft. We came in, we're going to go through this just in the natural progression of things, what the Giants accomplished over those first specifically 3 rounds, because those are the big names. Obviously, they used a lot of draft capital to make sure they were able to accomplish what they wanted to. As I said, we covered Deonte Banks, but it was another scenario like we saw last year with Joe Schoen, seeing a player, wanting to target a player, being willing to move around the board a little bit. We liked getting Deonte Banks at that spot. And I think a little bit of a theme here for the Giants in these first 3 rounds was players that were not expected to be available in and around where the Giants were selecting.
Yeah, when you talk about the Giants in the first round, we talked about getting Deonte Banks, but as the board started looking like, wow, there's a lot of cornerbacks and wide receivers still here as we get to 15, 16, 17, it all of a sudden, makes Joe Schoen and the team think maybe there's a guy that we had ranked in our top 10 best players available that's going to be sitting there for us at 25. You don't actually know. And, Dan Duggan of the Athletic and others have come out and said that Joe Schoen has admitted that he was calling to move up to draft potentially Zay Flowers in that run of wide receivers. The big problem that Joe Schoen had was, as you could see, those 4 teams in front of him all needed wide receivers as well. So they weren't going to trade with Joe Schoen and give him the wide receiver that he needed. But it is fascinating to think about how different the Giants draft could have been, especially in those early picks, if one of them would have said yes to it. All of a sudden, the Giants get the wide receiver. Then what does the 2nd round or 3rd round look like? It might have been drastically different, Adam.
Yeah, it's funny, too, because I'm a really big fan of Deonte Banks. I think that that's a great selection for the Giants. We talked about that on draft night. But to your point, because I think we had said this coming into the draft, if you go back and you can actually even look at the way some of the picks fell, especially in and around the top of the 2nd round, right? We know Joey Porter Jr., he makes it all the way to the 2nd round and goes where his father played with the Pittsburgh Steelers. But you also had a couple other cornerbacks as you work your way through there. Julius Brents out of Kansas State wasn't a guy that I looked at too intently, but Cam Smith out of South Carolina, certainly. Tyreek Stevenson, who went just ahead of the Giants' 2nd round selection at 57. It was funny. I did have that thought process of, well, if you could have gotten a wide receiver as opposed to the cornerback, I maybe could have seen the Joe Schoen similar scenario. Little marginal move here. Let's get up a spot or 2 and make sure we then go address the cornerback position. You can give me your thoughts there. But my other thing was, when we looked at the board and you talk about in that first round, the one player that stands out to me, we understand the Giants, interior offensive line, cornerback, wide receiver. Those were the big needs that they really wanted to fill early in this draft, and they did that. I will say, and we talked about this on draft night too, Nolan Smith going to the Philadelphia Eagles, 16th overall on ESPN's big board. It's not a position of desperate need because you have Ojulari, you have Kayvon Thibodeau, but injury concerns never hurts to have more weapons on the defensive side. I will say, even at 25 there, if you'd stood pat, there's a real value, right? We talk about best player available. I do wonder if Deonte Banks hadn't been there and the wide receivers are also gone at that point. That's just at some point you go, the talent's too good here, and we'll just become that much better in that area of our defense.
Well, Adam, don't you think it is kind of funny that people are always like, you don't draft for need, you draft for the best player available? It's like, okay, well, the Chiefs, with like one of the last picks in the first round, if they had Will Levis ranked as their best player available, are the Chiefs going out and drafting a quarterback being like, guys, we stick to our guns, we only go with the best player available? It's like, you have the best player available in the sport as your starting quarterback. So it seems like there needs to be just a little bit of discretion involved when making these picks. But for the Giants, to your point, would I have been upset? It would have been a little bit of a head scratcher if Smith went to the Giants, just knowing that there are just such areas of need. Even if you had Smith ranked around the same that you had Banks, Banks provides you so much more as cornerback number 2 in an area of need that I'm just glad that the best player available or close to it matched up with exactly the positional need the Giants had.
And don't forget, make it even easier, right? The Giants moved up that one spot there in the first round. Dalton Kincaid, tight end, right? 14th on ESPN's overall big board. If you get sucked into the best player available scenario, the Giants are saying, I know we signed Darren. Well, we got traded for Darren Waller. But we're going to get a run heck of a weapon here on the offensive side of the ball, and go, totally. But I'm also looking at the other things that you need to address here. So go
Well,
ahead.
the one other thing I was going to say about the first round, it's interesting that Joe Schoen was trying to call teams in front of him to try to trade up. Potentially, people are speculating it was for Zay Flowers. He also got calls from his former team and the general manager of the Buffalo Bills asking to trade into 25 and for the Giants to move back. But Joe Schoen was so convinced that he needed a player like Deonte Banks that was that positional first round grade for him that he had to pull the trigger. So for me, it ended up working out great because as we talk about after the first round, the way the board fell in the second and into the third round really was to the Giants' benefit, right?
Yeah, I think so. And, coming up later this week, I am at some point going to do my alternate version of what the draft could have looked like, including that potential trade back there with the Bills when we talk about some of the other cornerback potentials. Never going to necessarily equal first round value, but what other, compilation could you have put together here? To your point, though, we get into the second round. We're going to touch back in on the wide receiver position when we get to Jalin Hyatt and other scenarios that could have played out. But this is the old, you're concerned in the first round. We got to make the move up. Couldn't get the wide receiver. Okay, let's make sure we go get one of the best cornerbacks available. You saw Wink Martindale's reaction. Excellent. And then in the second round, you're just kind of sitting there, letting the board unfold for you. And, a guy that I was high on in Tippmann, he ended up going a little bit sooner. But you get Michael Schmitz, who he's the best pure center in the draft class. That is something that seems to be universally a truth among all NFL teams. Now, is there a lack of versatility if you wanted to play him at guard or try him out? Yes, there is. But when the Giants have a very clear need and a day one starter need there, I think the trickle down impact across the Giants' interior offensive line going into camp, gosh, does getting a number one like this really help you kind of crystallize everything? And this is what you and I talked about. Remember, going back a few years, we would say you never take certain types of players in the early rounds potentially because of the value. But we both got there coming to this draft as saying, you also have to look again, best player available is one thing, and then also filling a desperate need that you have not been able to address ever since you got Daniel Jones, even going back to the previous regime, right? Consistent play in front of him at the center position. Feels like they got that at 57.
Yeah, you were very high on Jonathan Mingo throughout the kind of scouting process leading up to the draft.
Yes.
Obviously, that got my attention. I looked at him, big-bodied guy. Obviously from Ole Miss, just reminded me of the size and stature of someone like AJ Brown, which is that prototypical number one type wide receiver. And we started talking about Adam. It's like if you don't go wide receiver in the first round, and then all of a sudden you're kind of looking around, is there a wide receiver that you think is going to be the alpha in the room? Is it better to pivot and take an area of need? And it just so happened that the Giants got really fortunate. I think anyone that was watching the second round of the draft and saw the name John Michael Schmitz just continue to fall, and we're like, wait a second, is there a chance that he's going to be there for us? Do we need to go trade up for this guy because it's such an area of need with minimal snaps on the current roster at center? And then all of a sudden, Joe Schoen pulled it off, was able to get John Michael Schmitz, the center out of Minnesota, without having to trade up, which was a huge win for him. He went 57th overall, Adam. And Senior Bowl, they said he was the best offensive lineman by a mile, like not even close to anyone else. polished, ready to go. His run blocking is the best. NFL Draft Buzz said it was the best in the last few years that they had seen come out of any of these offensive linemen. You're talking about a guy that has Pro Bowl potential starting week one, has the size, has everything you want. And most people say that he was the number one center on the board, even though other centers went in front of him. It felt like, man, the Giants didn't reach. They didn't overspend. They got that talent at the center position at 57 without having to do anything else. It was a tremendous move for Joe Schoen and the Giants.
Yeah, and the really here's the big part for me. We talked about what it looked like for the Giants from a depth perspective before they got Schmitz, before this draft started. The idea was, well, Ben Bredesen is going to compete at the center position potentially, and then you're also thinking about, well, could Shane Lemieux? They talked about him last year, and he had the injuries, but some versatility, right? So you're going to go into camp with a couple of players that have had some nice moments, haven't looked so good, are kind of what you feel like serviceable depth players that you want to have in a pinch on your roster, but don't want to rely on week in and week out. Now, all of a sudden, John Michael Schmitz plugs in at the center position. And then when you think about the guard positions and the backup center position, great. Now all you guys figure it out. From Shane Lemieux, Ben Bredesen, Mark Lewinsky is there too. Joshua Zudu drafted last season as well. So now you have 3-4 bodies, and you say, yeah, the guard positions, the backup center position, let's get into camp. Let's see how these guys play out and start to kind of line up our roster. And you and I have also discussed about the offensive line play. We both believe, not unlike Andrew Thomas, that Evan Neal's going to come into year number 2 and start to show a little bit of refinement and have a little bit of that leap forward. So guess what? 3. Give me 3 across the board, right? Give me my left tackle, give me my center, give me my right tackle. I'll live with hopefully consistent, if not average play at the other guard positions, because you're kind of mitigating that risk by having high talent players. And now 3 out of your 5 starting offensive linemen are going to be first or second round players for the New York Football Giants. That matters. And it's the thing, never want to look backwards, but it's the thing that was never accomplished in the previous regime, right? Spend some high draft capital and get the guys that are going to solve these problems.
Yeah, you can't, as a Giant fan, say that Joe Schoen didn't make the offensive line a priority. Like, look at what he's done since he's been here.
Make it a priority and actually have it work out.
Right. Like it's one thing to say it's a priority. It's another to actually make actions that show you thought it was a priority. And that's exactly what Joe Schoen did. Obviously having Andrew Thomas already on the roster certainly helps, considering he is a Pro Bowl type left tackle. But he spent, Joe Schoen has spent draft capital over the last 2 seasons. You mentioned first round draft pick on Evan Neal, second round pick on John Michael Schmitz. He also spent a third rounder on Joshua Zudu. He took Marcus McKeithen. He used his biggest offseason free agency signing was Mark Lewinsky of any position possible. So he's used draft capital. He's used what little funds he had in terms of free agency. He has tried to address it. And if the Giants can't figure out the offensive line after he's put all of this in there, then it almost goes to something else, whether it's scheme or talent evaluators or something else, because we've clearly invested enough to be a competent, if not above average offensive line now.
Now let's get to the big one here. And this is where it does become interesting to me. Jalin Hyatt, we talk about him. They're in the 3rd round. The Giants pick at 89. They see a player who's falling 49th overall on ESPN's big board. So the Giants make the move to get up to what ends up being 73. So they move 16 positions up to get the falling wide receiver. Now, I think the easy way to look at this would be, first of all, speed, can take the top off the defense. He's going to be a real weapon. You like that. You want to say, why did he fall? He doesn't have a complete route tree yet, right? If you believe in him as a player and believe in him as a student of the game, as he develops those route trees, it's going to make him that much more dangerous. But he's a player that can take the top off the defense, and it's something the Giants desperately need. We know Wan'Dale Robinson's still going to be coming back from injury, and you think about everybody else. We have a fondness for even Darius Slayton, but we know he's a 5th-round pick, right? So there's a little bit of a pressure here, I think, to Jalin Hyatt in a good way of, yeah, we took you in the mid-3rd, but really you were a 2nd-round talent. And that means that it comes with a stipulation. You need to come in and be an effective player ready to make an impact. I do have a bit of 2 sides to this coin. I like the player, I like the talent, and I like that after 3 rounds, after 3 picks, Joe Schoen addressed the top 3 needs of the Giants had.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you look at it, going back up and getting Jalin Hyatt was huge for the Giants. And Joe Schoen was actually targeting Jalin Hyatt with that 2nd-round pick. He sat there and said, I think I'm going to go with him. If John Michael Schmitz is not on the board for the Giants, Jalin Hyatt would have most likely have been drafted with that 2nd-round pick, according to some of the people that were in the room, sources, beat writers, etc. The Giants end up walking away with all three of those big impact, big time players, top 5 at each of their positions in this draft. It was tremendous. And Adam, for me, there's just something different about this draft than last year's draft. From the second that Wan'Dale Robinson was drafted, I had question marks about where he was drafted based on his size and whether or not it would work. And what I find fascinating is if you go back and you look at the projections on where Wan'Dale Robinson was expected to go, he was expected to go anywhere between 80 and 125, and the Giants kind of reached a little bit earlier for him. That's not the case in this draft, and that's what I think is important. They got established talent that was ranked very high by both, by any measure, whether it's CBS, NFL.com, PFF, NFL Draft Buzz, you name it. Both Deonte Banks, John Michael Schmitz, and Jalin Hyatt were all ranked higher than where the Giants drafted them, showing that they got great value in each of these 3 picks.
Yeah, the value is definitely there across the board here for us. 5th best ranked wide receiver by ESPN. Defensive back there in Deonte Banks. 2nd best player at the position in terms of offensive line for Schmitz in this draft. 7th highest, though, when it comes to Jalin Hyatt on ESPN's board. And one of the players that overtook him was Jonathan Mingo. And this is just I don't know. I don't want to take the damper out of it. I'm excited about it. The interesting thing to me is you mentioned Wan'Dale Robinson, while a player at the time, we thought I got excited immediately because that's what I do once you draft to the Giants. You're now my guy. I'm excited. But we both said, okay, you reached a little bit on him. Now there's a bit of a curiosity for me because you go back to that selection of Wan'Dale Robinson. You go back to the selection of Kadarius Toney. He was on this roster at a minimum, I should say. Where is this organization in terms of putting together a quality wide receiver core? You can make the case they're better at identifying kind of discarded talent and maximizing their value than they have been identifying the highest possible. And I only bring it up to say, Jonathan Mingo to me, and when we talk about this scenario of, well, maybe the Giants could have traded back a little bit in the first round. And with that extra capital, could they have gone up from 57 to target a Jonathan Mingo? Now, all things being equal, you have the center fall into your lap, but you don't know that at the time, right? So standing pat and saying, we'll just let Schmitz fall to us at 57, done deal. If you didn't know that going into it, there was a moment for me where I thought, you got to get to 38, 39 to get Jonathan Mingo. Everyone regards him as coming out and being as complete across the board as any wide receiver that you're going to get in and around that range. The capital they gave up was marginal to get from 86 to 73. I would have been fascinated to see what it would have cost to go get that player there at 38, at 39, something in that range. And then what's the trickle down effect, right? What will we be saying if we came out after 3 picks and we don't love the center, or maybe they didn't get a center, right? By the time they end up picking at 89, if you went up from 57. So there's interesting scenarios there. I will say personally, that if you had come out of this draft with Jonathan Mingo instead of Jalin Hyatt, I would have been much more ecstatic about that. However, the combination of what they accomplished, to your point, it's hard to come out of this and say Deonte Banks, Schmitz, Jalin Hyatt, collectively, you brought together a lot of talent at a lot of positions in need.
You hit the nail on the head there. The top end talent that the Giants were able to get, this isn't just like fill a hole, we'll try to figure out what the situation is later. Like Deonte Banks is a dog. Like he is a guy that could be a number 1 corner in this league for the Giants. Like he has that ability and that raw athleticism. You talk about John Michael Schmitz. People are saying that he could be a Pro Bowler even in his rookie year. Like that's how good he is. They say it's not just that he's good at run blocking. He's elite at run blocking. And they say his pass blocking isn't bad. It's just not as good as his
Right.
run blocking skills. And so for me, when you hear these things of like, he was the top center on Mel Kiper Jr.'s board and others, you look at Jalin Hyatt. Yes, some people had him ranked 7th and they had him a little bit lower. But when you look at Pro Football Focus and DraftNet and ESPN and NBC Sports and NFL.com had Jalin Hyatt ranked as the 10th highest wide receiver, 10th highest player just in the entire draft with his upside and speed. So like there's a wide range of where these players can go. But the most important part is you're talking about guys that have tremendous upside for the Giants in terms of what they could project to be. The Giants didn't mortgage the future to go get any of them. And if you look at it in totality, as you mentioned, move up a little bit for Deonte Banks, move up a little bit for Jalin Hyatt, and get lucky with John Michael Schmitz being there at 57. the Giants didn't have to give up that much draft capital to get really high-end talent at these positions.
No, yeah, some of what it comes down to is being decisive when you see a player you want to get and then getting a little bit lucky, right? That's kind of what we get here. First round, wide receivers are going off the board. We can't make that move, but there's our cornerback. We're going to get up there, that one extra pick to make sure we get it done. Second round, we stood pat. Hey, happy days. It fell into us. And then you see that player in Jalin Hyatt and you go and you pursue him. So it is certainly very good. And by the way, you mentioned Mel Kiper. All three of these players, so he had mentioned on draft day after day number 2, that got the Giants 3 players in his top 45. And 2 of those picks were outside of the top 45, right? So when you do something like that, you feel like you've accomplished it. And the difference to me from last year to this year, they condensed their assets, right? They had a lot, but they condensed them to get players that they thought were going to fill specific needs. And we talk about it going into last year's draft. Hey, man, there's a lot of holes, depth and otherwise, that the Giants need to achieve here across this draft class. It's still true this season, but it felt a little bit different because you went out and got a couple of extra wide receivers to add in that room, because you went out and addressed linebacker in free agency, and you hope that some of the injured players from a year ago are going to come back and contribute, right? So there are those things that I think Joe Schoen and the Giants did to make this a very targetable and aggressive draft for them, where they're going to walk away. We'll talk about Eric Gray, certainly, as we move along. I'll be honest with you. I have a mild gripe about that, given maybe what else you could have done there. But the first 3 picks, man, the first 3 picks, and some people have debated this. Like, they broke down where Jalin Hyatt fits in. For me, it's with no doubt. Deonte Banks is a starter day 1. And Dable said, come and compete, earn it, right? Same thing. Schmitz, come and compete, earn it. You're a day 1 starter. Jalin Hyatt, there's no reason that he shouldn't be, based on what his talent level was, where he was projected on some boards, just overall, let alone at the position. He's got to come in here and claim the spot, right? Paris Campbell, I know he was drafted high. We know he's talented. Doesn't matter. You are a young, talented player. Get your nose in the playbook, learn the route trees, get on the same page with Daniel Jones. I expect to see you out there week 1, contributing at a high level and opening up a lot of this field for Saquon Barkley, Darren Waller, Isaiah Hodgins, and everybody else that they're going to put out there around Jones.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's his for the taking. At the end of the day, Adam, Wan'Dale Robinson's hurt. Sterling Shepard's hurt. They need to come back in. There's going to be plenty of reps for Jalin Hyatt to be able to prove it. And you know what's the nice thing to say is that the Giants got Jalin Hyatt, John Michael Schmitz, and Deonte Banks. And if you told most people that they drafted any of those 3 with their first round selection, people would have likely been happy with that selection. Like, we secured our Pro Bowl center with the 25th pick. People have been like, okay, I'm okay with it. We got our 4.38 40 wide receiver, the 6 foot, like, need to address it. Okay, we're happy. We got the cornerback. It doesn't matter which way you slice it. We would have been happy with one of them. We got all 3. I think all Giant fans should feel pretty good about the direction of this team.
That's it. A lot more to do in terms of coverage around this team. Obviously, like I said, later in the week, what could have been? What are alternate versions that maybe the Giants could have accomplished in this draft? We'll talk about the back end. We'll talk about Eric Gray. We'll talk about some of the unrestricted free or unsigned draft picks, that the Giants went out and got there. Very different from a year ago, where they were adding every single player you could find. They were a little bit more selective in this post-draft scenario as well. So plenty of things to discuss, looking over the roster, resetting depth charts. You get us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at AndyMac214, at Adam Armbrecht, and on your podcast feed where we get those needs fulfilled. But until next time, my friends, with the draft in the books, as Andy Mackowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.